Good evening, everybody. Evening. So good to be here. Sure, the sound is sounding nice. Thanks, Brian. It's always a great privilege to be able to share with you what I feel God's placed in my heart for us tonight. So we'll jump straight in. So we've currently been in a series where we've been looking at the topic of opposition. Okay? But just to backtrack a bit, if you remember, we have been going through the book of Nehemiah. And we read in the book of Nehemiah where God put it in the heart of Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild and restore the walls of Jerusalem. Remember that? If you don't, it's okay. And we found that in the first few chapters, we find Nehemiah going, as he gets to Jerusalem, he spends some time surveying the area, doesn't tell anybody what he's going to do. He surveys the area, and then he rallies everybody together, and then he reveals his plan to everybody. And he gets major buy-in by everybody. And everybody starts the work. But what we find what's interesting is, as they start the work, we find so does the opposition start. And it's from here where we started our current series about opposition. Okay? Now, I don't know about you guys, but this topic around opposition has been very, very good. And if you don't know, I'm sure most of us know, but if you don't, if you've missed any of the preachers regarding this topic on opposition, we do have a Glenridge YouTube and podcast channel. Go listen to them. It's really, really worthwhile to go give it a listen. So this topic has been so good to go through because it's been helping us to understand that opposition is very much part of Christian life. Though we don't like it. If you like opposition, please go and speak to Paul afterwards. He'll pray for you. Opposition is not something we should be surprised at whenever it comes around our way. We should always be prepared for it, especially when we take on the purposes of God in our lives. Going through this topic has also shown us that whenever we face opposition in our lives, it doesn't mean that we've done something wrong. It's important to know that. Because we can feel like that. It's like when things are opposing us, it's like maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I've done something wrong. Maybe Jesus doesn't love me. Or all these questions come at us. So it's important to understand it doesn't always mean that there's something wrong. We face opposition because we have a real enemy. He's real. It's not like what the world depicts. We have a real enemy. And he's always at work, trying to stop what God is trying to do in and through our lives. So if you might ask yourself, why is it so important to understand and learn about opposition? The reason is, it's to keep us who are called to carry out God's purposes from becoming discouraged. Does that make sense? It's important. Opposition has a voice. It has a voice. We can't put our heads in the sand and just positive thinking. Opposition is real and it has a voice. And when we give ear to its influence, it can so easily discourage us and cause us to stop what God wants to do in us and through our lives. We have to be aware of it. Now, tonight, we're going to look at a question, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to answer it. And the question is this: what do I do when I face opposition? And to start answering that question, I'd like us to first look at Matthew 7, verse 24 to 27. It's the parable of the wise and foolish men. It starts off by saying, therefore, this is Jesus speaking, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. In this parable that Jesus teaches us on, we can learn two very important things. The first thing is, both the wise and foolish men, both of them face the same opposition. We read that while both the wise and foolish men were building their houses, both of them encountered opposition. We read, it says, the rain came down for both of them. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against both the houses. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to opposition. There's no new tactic. We also see that the end goal of the opposition that came against them was to see that their houses that they were building would come crashing down. That's its aim. What they were building, the opposition came to break it down. Why do we say that? It's because we see this happening to the foolish man. So the first thing we can learn in this parable regarding opposition is everyone will face opposition. We must be aware that opposition will always come to try and discourage us as we embark on building anything good that God has called us to do. If God has called us, I just had two points that just came to mind that God has called each one of us to build. The first one is our relationship with Jesus. We are called to build our relationship with Him. The house is you. The way that you're building your house, how are you building it in regards to your relationship with Jesus? And this is a big one, because everything we do comes from that space on how we build. I mean, Paul preached this morning about we've got to know our identity. We've got to know who we are and know whose we are. That's the starting point to fight off against opposition. We've got to know who we are and whose we are. And we grow in that as we build our relationship with Jesus. We get to know better who we are and who He is to us. And the second one is every one of us are called to build on the call of God on our lives. If you don't know it, you have a call by God on your life. Every single one of us. There's no special, super spiritual Christian. Every one of us are called by God. And we can be sure that we will face opposition whenever we put our hands up to the call of God. It will come. So the first point we can learn from this parable is that we will face opposition whenever we decide to start building. And the aim of that opposition is to cause us to cause whatever we are building to come crashing down, to stop it. Now, the second point we can learn from this parable is, are we putting into practice what we hear? And this is very, very important. Jesus says, whoever hears my words and puts it into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And then he goes on to say, but whoever hears my words and does not put it into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Here we see that Jesus doesn't separate the wise man from the foolish man just because the one is building and the other is not. Both of them are building. It's interesting. He also doesn't separate them because the one hears his words and the other one doesn't hear his words. We can see both hear Jesus' words. He separates the wise man from the foolish man because the wise man puts into practice what the words of Jesus into his life. He puts it into practice. That's the difference. The wise man's house stood even though he faced the same opposition purely because he did not just listen to the words of Jesus. He acted on it. He put it into practice. He exercised it into his life. We have to be so careful. Even in the church, we can hear the words of Jesus Sunday to Sunday. We can even spend time with Jesus. We can read our Bibles. We can worship Him. We can encounter Jesus in incredible ways. But unless we put into practice what we hear Him saying to us in those moments, what we build in them will not stand. Does that make sense? Glenridge, it's not enough for us to just hear from Jesus. It's also important to put into practice what He is saying. That's how we build well. And that's when the opposition comes, we will find that we've actually built on a rock. And when opposition comes up against us, we've built well. And we have a solid relationship with Jesus. We know Him. We know who we are. And no matter what comes up against us, our house will stand because we put it into practice. When we choose to not just hear Jesus' words in our lives, but also to put it into practice, it shows that we truly love Jesus. You know, imagine you telling somebody, can you please do this for me, and this, and the person just never does it. What is that portraying to you? You don't really matter. So when we put things into practice, when we put what Jesus is saying to us into practice, it shows that we truly love Him. Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey me. It shows that we truly treasure the person of God in our lives. It shows that we fully trust Him, and it shows that our faith and confidence is in Him and Him alone. Does that make sense? This is how David lived his life. David faced, in David's life, he faced a lot of opposition. From the day when he was a little shepherd boy out in the field, and Samuel the prophet came to his house to anoint the next king of Israel. From that day on, from when David got anointed, opposition started coming at him, left, right, and center. David had to flee from King Saul. Think about it. Fleeing from a king of a nation. Imagine a king of a nation after you all the time. That's pretty intense opposition. I mean, that's like, imagine Donald Trump after you. Saul was jealous and fearful of David because he was afraid that he was going to take his throne. Saul started seeing, Saul was told by God, through Samuel, that what you've done, you disobeyed God, and now God's going to hand your kingdom over. And this caused, when Saul started picking up, there's something about this guy, that's when opposition started to come against David through Saul. So David also, he also faced opposition. He faced the rebellion led by his own son, Absalom. Imagine somebody in your own family leading a rebellion against you. That's some serious opposition. David also faced foreign and internal opposition a lot of the time throughout his life. A lot. David went through many battles. David understood opposition. But yet, in the face of opposition, he wrote Psalm 27. And we're going to start off with Psalm 27, verse 1 to 3. This is David writing. And as we read through this, put yourself in his shoes. David writes, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident." That is powerful, eh? Here David shows us where his trust and confidence lied. His trust and confidence was in God. In the midst of what he was facing, in the midst of fear, in the midst of armies trying to besiege him, he trusted in God. This is why David writes, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" David was confident in God that no matter what dark place he would find himself in, he knew that he had God with him as his light to guide him through it. He knew it. He believed that God would not just light his way through whatever opposition he was facing, but that God would deliver him as well. This is why he writes, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." So God is not just our light to help us through things. He saves us in the end. He delivers us from it. And we'll get to that a bit later. There's time between getting guidance and having salvation. The question is, do we have this kind of trust and confidence in God whenever we find ourselves in the face of opposition? Do we look to God to be our light when the darkness of opposition tries to overwhelm us? Can we say, "The Lord is my light"? Do we believe and trust that God is not just able to guide us through whatever we face, but that He's also able to save us completely? David trusted in God. David did not allow the voice of fear from the opposition to have control over his life. He kept God where God was meant to be. He kept God on the throne of his heart. He never once allowed fear to take the place of God in his life. The other thing we can learn from David is that his confidence came from the presence of God. He writes in Psalm 27, verse 4 to 5, He says, "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock." David loved the presence of God. Running to God and being with him in his presence was a lifestyle of David. It was a lifestyle. From out in the fields, he had always practiced, he had always been in the presence of God. All his life. In actual fact, David was the man, when Saul became king, Israel had lost the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God. And from that time when they had lost it, all the way through the reign of Saul, Saul never once thought of the presence of God, of the ark, to bring it back. Not once. But as soon as David became king, it was burning inside of him to have the presence of God back in Jerusalem. David loved the presence of God. David understood that his strength, safety, and guidance came from the dwelling place of God. That's why the way that we build our personal walks with God is so important. It's so, so important. Guys, this walk with Jesus, it's a personal, relational thing. Whenever we face opposition, do we already have a lifestyle of running into the dwelling place of God? Do you already have that kind of lifestyle, that you're already spending time? You also enjoy the presence of God, being in his presence. Because that's where you get to know him. It's being with him. Being with somebody is when you get to know that person. Do we have a lifestyle of just being with him? Learning from him, hearing from him, and then putting it into practice? Do we seek God in prayer before reacting to whatever we may be facing? I've found that whenever I'm in the middle of any difficult situation, and I've got to be careful here because I've got my wife sitting here. Whenever I find that I'm in the middle of any difficult situation, I find that when I go into my room, and I close my door, and I just lay what I'm going through before God, I found that God seems to get bigger than what I'm facing. Does that make sense? It's like my perspective on what I'm going through changes. But what I've also found, when I don't do that, when I react before I go to God about it, I mess things up badly. Because you know what happens? Fear gets a bigger voice. Insecurity gets a bigger voice. Opposition gets a bigger voice into my life. That's why our strength lies in the presence of God. That's where our confidence and our trust and our guidance, it lies being with Jesus. And the thing is, nobody can give that to you. It's up to us, each individually, on how we build with Jesus. There is strength and guidance in the presence of God. The best thing to do when we face any opposition is to first bring it into the presence of God. Remember that. That is what you do when you face opposition. The first thing is bring it to God. Get his perspective on it. Get his voice to speak into it. The other thing we can learn from David is not just to run to God, but also to seek God's ways. And then to put into practice what he teaches us. what he reveals to us. So it's no point you're going through something, you're facing opposition, and then you run to God, and then God gives you revelation and speaks into that space, but then you walk out of your room and you don't put what he said into practice. It doesn't make sense. Psalm 27, verse 11, David says this: "Teach me your way, Lord. Lead me in a straight path because of my oppressors." Here we see David asking the Lord to teach him his ways. So David's in the presence of God. And he's saying, "Lord, teach me your ways." David understands that doing things God's way will always lead him through a straight path. Opposition, when opposition comes, it always brings chaos and it always brings distraction. That's how it destroys. Chaos and distraction. That's its aim. But God's ways always leads to a straight path. Do you see that? That's why David says, "Teach me your ways, Lord. Lead me in a straight path because of my oppressors around me. I have oppressors around me. Teach me your ways. How can I walk through this? Show me the straight path, Lord. I'll do it your way because that will lead me through it." Here we read that David positions his heart to hear and learn from God. And we can see from the language he uses in this verse that he is ready to put whatever God says into practice. You can see it. When we face opposition and we run to God, we should have the same attitude. We should also position our hearts, not just to hear, but to also put into practice what God wants to teach us. Most of the time, the only way over an obstacle is through it. It would be great if God can just take the obstacle away. But most of the time, the only way through a storm is through it. And the way we go through it is by hearing God and then putting into practice what he says. That's God being the light. God is a light in the darkness. When the darkness surrounds you and you come to him and his light begins to shine, it's when you start acting on that, you'll find your way coming through it. Now, lastly, as I land this preach, David ends this incredible psalm in Psalm 27, verse 13 to 14. David says this: "I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Waiting on God. This is the tough part. This is that space between. Waiting on God is very much part of our spiritual walk with Jesus. We've got to know this. This is part of the walk. Why do I say this? It's because only in the waiting, where we find our faith in God can be exercised. If you had to pray and ask God, "Lord, help me in this," and he answers straight away, there's not much faith needed for that. But the scriptures teaches us in Hebrews 11, verse 6, it says, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God." We please God when we put our faith in him. We please God when we wait patiently for him, even in the midst of opposition. even in the midst of whatever we may be facing. So waiting on God is very much part of the way we face opposition. That's where things get tested. No, we sang that song, There's Another in the Fire. That story is with the 3 young men. And you've got King Nebuchadnezzar, and he builds this idol. And he tells everybody, you're going to bow to this. And if anybody refuses to bow, you see that fiery furnace over there? We're going to chuck you in there. Opposition. But these 3 young men decide, no, we're taking a stand. So they take a stand. But you know how funny it is when you take a stand in God against opposition? You know where your faith gets really tested? It's when Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, is it? Make it 7 times hotter. Make it 7 times hotter. Now let's see if your faith stands. Are you confident that even when you are trusting God for something and you go forward and then you get the news from God and then it's like 7 times hotter? You're like, oh my gosh, Lord, where are you? Wait. Wait on the Lord. So waiting on God is part of the way we face opposition. And we can wait confidently because we know that, as David writes, we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Let's be confident about that. God is not against us. He is for us. Nothing is impossible for God. We just need to keep trusting Him and keep finding ourselves in His presence. When things get overwhelming, run to Him, and He'll put it in right perspective. And then when He speaks to us and reveals how to walk through it, put it into practice. Whatever it is you're facing, that's showing faith, and you're building with Him. And in time, you realize you come through the other side actually a better person. What the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good. Cool beans. I trust that that's been encouraging. Cool. Amen.